Hello and welcome to AIA's California second statewide town hall to discuss the impact of the pandemic on the architecture profession in California. I'm Stephen Hall. I'm the 2020 AIA Vice President of Professional Practice and currently the Director of Construction Administration for Pfeiffer in both LA and New York. We have joining us today Deborah Gerard, our 2020 AIA California President, members of AIA California staff, and two guests from AXA XL Global Commercial Insurance and Reinsurance. We know we're all experiencing changing times as we settle in, and we appreciate you taking this hour to connect with us and your colleagues at the AIA. I'm sure many of you had settled into the new work from home. I've learned a new acronym, WFH, lifestyles, and are hopefully starting to navigate with new reality with more ease. However, we know many insecurities and worries have started to weigh heavily on all of you about the health of the profession, the future of our firms, and how the pandemic will permanently alter the way we conduct businesses in the coming years. While we don't have a crystal ball, we brought you the next best thing. We have with us today two risk managers from AXA XL to help shed some light on how they've seen the profession evolve in just this short time. They have come to talk to you today about the new reality when it comes to the business community, client management, project execution, maintaining a cohesive team, contractual hurdles, general risk management, as we try to navigate the world during the and after COVID-19. Okay. We want to remind you that there are resources available on the AIACA website under this COVID-19 resources tab. They're updated daily, and there's a link available for donations to help support the California Architectural Foundation's COVID-19 Emergency Fund to support the production of PPE equipment in your local communities. We also stay up to date on federal and state stimulus details through the AIACA website. Okay, we're going to touch on many topics today and cover a lot of information. We encourage you to type your questions to our presenters using the Q&A button located at the black bar, either on the top or bottom of your computer screen. We'll have about 10 minutes at the end of the presentation for our presenters to answer some questions. In the event we don't get to everyone, our presenters will respond in writing to all questions from the Q&A. We'll make that document and the recording of this presentation available to all attendees on our website. So this is the good part. On completing the town hall, you'll be receiving one learning unit for participating. It should appear on your AIA transcript within 2 weeks, but if you don't see it, please contact a member of AIACA staff and they will help you. And as a reminder, we are hosting two additional town halls in the upcoming weeks. If you're available, we'll love to have you attend. Tune into Relevance, our weekly email newsletter. I think it's coming more often than just weekly nowadays, the Wednesday before the announcement for each topic. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers for today's town hall. We have with us Brett Stewart and Patty Huntley from AXA XL. AXA XL is a specialty risk division of AXA, known for solving complex risks for companies and firms around the world through innovative insurance solutions. Brett Stewart is a risk manager for the design professional unit of AXA XL. He is responsible for developing risk management and education materials for AXA XL's architect and engineered insurers with the goals of minimizing the frequency and severity of loss exposures, while focusing on increasing best practices. Brent interfaces directly with brokers and other valued business partners, with the public and various trade organizations in an effort to promote issues that are relevant to the design community. Prior to his role as risk manager, he was senior claims examiner handling design professional claims for 7 years. He's a licensed California attorney and is a litigator at two San Francisco law firms for approximately 8 years. His practice focuses on construction and real estate litigation and represents a variety of clients, including owners, developers, contractors, and design professionals. Brent started his professional career in law, handling general liability claims for contractors at Argonaut Insurance. Brent is a graduate of the University of California at Santa Barbara and the University of San Francisco School of Law. He lives and works in Walnut Creek, California. Now, Patty is also a risk manager for Design Professions Unit of AXA XL. Patty's 35-year career includes extensive background in the AEC industry. She began her consulting career in 1989, sorry, 1989 with an environmental engineering firm, and as a senior project manager was responsible for design, build, remediation, redevelopment projects. Subsequently, for 14 years, she provided consulting services to AECs with a focus on project delivery and program management. As a member of the DP Loss Prevention and Client Education team, Patty works with brokers, their insurance, and trade associations, providing the resources and education to empower AE professionals to effectively manage risk design and construction. So please take it away, Patty and Brett.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Not quite.
Okay, one second.
There it is.
All right, thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you, Deborah. I appreciate the opportunity to present this topic today, and I'm excited to be here with my coworker, Patty. Patty brings a lot of experience to this, and she's got a lot of good insights. Here's just a little bit of a roadmap and agenda of where we're going. We're going to kick off our program today as we talk about our new reality, strategic and contractual risk management. Patty's going to talk about some of the strategic needs. So we're going to focus first on resource management, and then she's going to talk about client communication and also communicating with our own staff. And then something I know is on everybody's mind, and that's cash flow, how to manage that, and some options that may be out there for you. We're going to shift gears a little bit in part two. I'll be talking about some contractual considerations, and really from the standpoint of trying to build that 30,000-foot view of risk, so we can take an idea or take a look at our contracts and our projects and understand if we have to renegotiate something, how are we going to do that, and where are we going to go from there. We will leave hopefully about 10 minutes at the end of this presentation, and we ask that people submit their questions through the Zoom app on the Q&A, not the chat function, but the Q&A. Stephen, I think you are going to be monitoring some of those questions for us. So if something comes up that's really pressing, we're happy to answer that question as we go. Otherwise, we'll reserve those questions for the end. So let's go ahead and kick this off. And Patty, why don't I hand this over to you?
Great. Thank you, Brett. I'm going to start by talking about a couple of issues related to resource management, but now that we're over 6 weeks into the stay at home, a number of these issues on the first and second slide have already been worked through for the most part, one way or the other. But just quickly on number one, initially in March, when we really started to see a quick change in the economy as well as our work environment, there was a lot of basically scrambling to try and figure out the status of projects. Now, for the most part, we have projects that we know we're continuing to work on and continuing to develop. And the number one thing we always have to keep in mind is it should be invisible to our clients, whether we're working from our physical office or whether we're working from home. And project management is still key, and as well as excellent client service. Number three, develop a backup plan. If you haven't done this for your specific projects, what you want is a process so that everybody that works on every team knows what needs to happen if somebody becomes unavailable. And also that it doesn't have to be unique for every situation. So if everybody understands your process for how to communicate that to the client, how to make sure that the team is going to be good going forward, that's a good step. I think this is particularly important for sole practitioners. If you work for yourself and you are the only person in your company, I would suggest you get an agreement, a written agreement in place with another practitioner that could take take up your work if you became unavailable. And getting that in place now versus later would probably save a lot of headache for everybody involved, but it could also assure your clients that you have a backup plan in case you become unavailable. Next slide, Brett. Number 5 on this is evaluating your options for staff changes. One of the things that most firms recognize is over the last several years, they've spent a lot of time and energy recruiting and retaining their employees, and they're really reluctant to let go of them. And so they're looking at ways to try and hang on to the staff that they have. And they include, in some cases, across the board, salary cuts. Some firms are doing a reduction in hours, and other firms are doing a combination of all of these, including retraining people and putting people in different areas of their business that maybe they weren't as familiar with, but they feel they have some talent that they could bring up to speed. Crisis management. If you did not have a crisis management team in place or a crisis management plan, you still need one. And the thing that I think you really want to have in place is a central location for all the information, and you want a central form of communication to your staff as well as your clients. And in order to really have this go well, you should have a plan in place so that everybody knows what needs to be communicated and how it's going to be communicated, and everybody can be comfortable with that. Next slide, please. Client communication is more important than ever. Your goal right now, whether you're in your office, which most of you are not, or you are working from home, which most of us are, is your continued excellent levels of service. We need to have this background of where we're working not be the issue. We need to continue to keep in mind that we still have clients, we still need to take great care of them, and we are able to do that no matter where we are in the world. One of the reasons I want you to continue to have, or maybe even up the frequency of communication with your clients, is because there are still a lot of projects and events that are on a wait and see basis. And so some of these things may change, and I want you to understand when that happens. And I also want you to understand that number 3, there may be ways that you can help clients make some of these decisions based on your information and understanding about the projects. So your background and your knowledge can be part of their planning process, and it's just one more way you can provide excellent service to your clients. Number 4, if you have any changes in your team, particularly the client-facing members of your team, again, if you have a plan and a process for how you're going to communicate this, I think it makes it much easier to have that happen. But it needs to be proactive. It needs to be there shouldn't be a gap in between any of those activities, at least that are visible to the client. So you should be willing to discuss that. In some cases, it might mean renegotiating some of the activities that you're completing on the project. Any changes that you make, though, please document them or update them in your contract. Number 5, continuing to work but not getting paid. This has become a more common refrain from owners of architectural as well as engineering firms. And the thing that I want you to remember is, hopefully, you have a contract in place or an agreement, and that agreement lines out the conditions for which you get paid. It's one of the many great reasons you should have a signed contract. And of course, Brett and I work in the insurance and liability insurance, and we understand the importance of having a signed contract. This is just one more reason to have a signed contract, because it lays out these conditions, and I want you to be able to talk to the client about those conditions. Here's what I don't want you to do. I don't want you to send an invoice, hope it got there, hope it's okay, and hope they pay it at some point. Because I think they need to know, one, They want somebody reaching out. Did you receive the invoice? Do you have any questions? Were you the right person to send the invoice to? Because your clients are probably having people work from home also, so things might have changed. Check their process. You can definitely put in a request to get paid, document the fact that you've made that attempt, talk to them, and maybe even remind them of the contract. Maybe that doesn't make any difference. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable. And a lot of people feel uncomfortable. And in fact, they will often say something like, I don't want to damage the relationship I have with the client by apparently just simply asking to get paid. There is a hammer approach to making sure you get paid. And the hammer approach is you're just going to hold all your documents and not submit them or turn them over to the client. That does run the risk of damaging your relationship with the client on some level. And I understand that. On the other hand, the client's not paying you, and in some ways they have already damaged the relationship by not paying them. So you need to weigh those out as owners. I think you should continue to be professional, but also continue to ask to get paid. In some cases, I've heard of firms working out payment plans with their clients on some of their larger, more outstanding invoices. Number 6, some clients have come back to their architects and engineers and said, we want to lower your fee on this project. We want to reevaluate what's going on in terms of your cost for doing this work. What I would suggest is come back to them with alternatives besides just cutting your fee if they're trying to save money. If ultimately their goal is to save money, what are other ways you can accomplish this besides lowering your fee? Talk to them about scopes of work, completing a current phase of work, and then maybe putting the work on hold until they're more certain of their funding going forward. Offer them options, and a number of you have probably worked through these options on other projects at other times in the past. Bring those forward other than just agreeing to a fee reduction. Next slide, please. Staff communication is also more important than ever. Of course, we want you to be hopeful, but not over-optimistic, and also humor. It's good to just try and tickle the funny bone once in a while because we're all in the same situation. What you have to remind the staff of, and even yourselves, is this. We have 2 priorities right now. Our first priority is continuing our excellent client service, or even upping that a little bit. Excellent client service. We want to remind clients why they are happy we are still doing work on their project for them. The second thing is really looking at turning everybody who has a client-facing role, project managers on up, into people who are responsible for winning more work. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit in a minute. Checking in with the team. If you are a project manager on a large project and you have people who are working full-time just on your project, I would like you to make sure you're on the phone with that group every morning asking 2 questions. What did you get done yesterday? What do you plan on getting done today? Those 2 questions every day, just checking in, having a discussion. What did you get done yesterday? What are you planning to do today? Now, if there's a difference and they weren't able to accomplish some of the things they talked about yesterday, what's getting in their way? What's hampering that? What help do they need? Those are the kind of things that need to happen on a daily basis. Number 4, work from home, and then the now return to work. We're going to spend a little more time on this in a minute, but again, guidance and information has to come from you, and it has to be proactive. Cybersecurity, number 5, has continued to be an issue. In fact, apparently it's even increased over time. The security threats have gone up. You have to remind your staff, please don't click on, don't open up links to websites that you're not familiar with or that are not familiar to our company. Number 6, project management is still critical. In fact, I think it's even more important than ever. Excellent service has to be where you're going all the time with your clients. It includes increasing your frequency of client management. For those of you who have more introverted project managers, they need to figure out a way to get over that and spend more time reaching out to the client with shorter communications, shorter length communications, more concise communication. I think there's going to be a bigger need, and there has been a bigger need for more written delegation. Trying to get everything done on a conference call can be very challenging. So more written delegation, and then of course, more frequent follow-up and feedback, which is why I like having the daily check-in with your team on, particularly on project work. Quality management. This is not the time to let that slide. We need to be following our processes for doing our work and our procedures that we've established and used over and over again. We also need to make sure we're doing the appropriate review and correction and checking that we've always done. And number 8, even though you're not able to talk with your colleagues directly, I don't want you to start putting things into emails about your clients or about the project that could be considered inappropriate or used against you down the road. I want you to continue to be thoughtful and mindful of the fact that your email could be used at some point to explain a situation that happened on your project. So we need to continue to be thoughtful and again, keep the email short. A lot of people are probably getting a whole bunch of emails now, maybe more than usual. Keep them short, keep them concise. Next slide, please. Cash flow. For those of you who are still printing an invoice and mailing it to your clients, there may not be somebody there to receive it at the office. It's time to switch over to electronic invoicing. Furthermore, I don't really think people want an envelope from an outside party that's gone through the mail and potentially been licked coming to their office. So electronic invoicing, if you haven't started doing it, you need to make that change. Once you have sent an invoice, please confirm it went to the right person and ask if there's any questions, anything that could potentially hold it up. You do need to make that proactive step. Your overhead labor, the 2 things your overhead should be supporting right now is excellent client service. Anything and everything they do should be on supporting excellent client service. The second thing, of course, is marketing and business development. Short-term costs, most folks have made decisions around these in the last 6 weeks. Stay on top of your WIP and AR. This is not the time to say, well, everything is slow, everything has gotten really cumbersome, we're not in the office, things aren't as fast. You really need to make an effort to make sure that, 1, your project managers are getting a weekly update of the costs that are being charged to their projects, because yes, people are at home. Yes, people appear to be very productive while they're working from home for a lot of firms. On one hand, on the other hand, are they charging the appropriate amount of time for the work that they're getting done? And accounts receivable, project managers need to be communicating with their clients on making sure that there's no questions about the invoices and making sure the clients are comfortable sending those invoices forward to get them paid. Number 6, if you can actually get a hold of your banker, this might be a nice time to negotiate a new line of credit because the rates are coming down. But I think even more important is number 7. If you're able to participate in the payroll protection program or the small business loan, of course, you all know that the first round of funding ran out, I don't know, within 2 weeks. There's a new round and people are scrambling to try and participate in that. But that, I think, is a more important effort right now than your line of credit. With that, next slide, Brett. So moving forward, what else can you do to support your existing clients? They are seeing changes, and in some cases, some of those have a wait and see, and they're going to make some decisions. How can you help them with those decisions? Are there other projects or other work that may come forward that you can provide support on? Talk to them about that. Be creative about what you can offer them. Some firms have made some slight adjustments to what they would normally offer clients and are seeing some work as a result of that. Number 2, this is time to update your strategic plan. Most strategic plans have a 5 to 7 year horizon. You need to pull it back and probably have it be closer to a 1 to 2 year horizon. What are some of the things that you're going to try and do going forward in this very short window versus a much longer window? And then use that to negotiate some of the issues, the unknown issues even, that you're going to have going forward. Again, if you have a crisis management plan, now's the time to update it. If you don't have one, now's the time to put one together. And speaking of plans and policies, we even have more that have come forward, including the return to work policies and guidelines. If we thought work from home and making all that happen was difficult, I think the return to work is going to be even more challenging, because there has to be a lot of decisions about everything from health and safety and hygiene and how you manage visitors that come into your space, as well as spacing of desks. There's a lot of decisions that are going to have to go into that for people to feel comfortable with their workspace. And I think it's going to be even more work than the work from home created. As far as work from home, I do think you need a policy. There was a survey completed by the Mercer Human Resource, I think that's the name of their company. Let's see here. Mercer Human Resource Consulting. They surveyed 400 employers. 76% are going to provide flexible work arrangements going forward. And if you think about that, working from home used to be considered an employee perk. Then it became a necessity. And now firms are, after having to be forced to experiment with this for the last 6 or so weeks, now firms are recognizing that, in fact, some of their employees are quite productive. I have talked to and heard of a number of firms that were thinking of expanding their office space and had been looking at options, and in some cases even getting ready to sign a lease. They've put that on hold until they can figure out exactly what kind of space they will need going forward. But part of that planning, and part of it will go into their strategic planning, is, do we all need to be in the same location, or can we have people who also work from home as part of being in our company? And so people are reevaluating that. They're also looking at the potential cost savings of not needing this extra floor space for folks if they are going to be working from home. So that work from home, return to work, all of that's going to probably roll back into your strategic planning. But I think going forward, think about what worked. Okay, don't assume that once you come back into the office, everything's going to be back to normal. Think about what worked. Try and bring that forward. Try and use that to the benefit of your organization moving forward. Number 6 may not make sense to some of you, but there will be some resumes that may come available. Continue to accept them and review them, because you never know how things are going to turn out going forward. Number 7, if you have folks who are maybe not as busy as they need to be, this is certainly the time to complete training programs. I have seen more training programs on Saturday mornings, which I had not seen in the past, and I've taken advantage of some of those. But this shouldn't be the number one priority. The number one priority should be, and Brett, I'm going to have you go to the next slide. The number one priority should be excellent client service and marketing. What else can we do to support our existing clients? And everyone should think about marketing. Project managers, with your existing clients, what are you doing to talk with your existing clients about any additional support you can provide or any additional work? Principals, business development people, senior people, what are you doing with your existing client base, as well as reaching out to new client bases or even new markets? The thing I want everybody to remember, though, with this is you should follow your strict go, no-go process. If you don't have one, this is the time to start having one. Be super selective. Don't use this scattershot approach to we'll respond to any RFP that comes our way because we are desperate. It's not necessarily the best use of that time. The best use of your time is to really make sure these are the folks that you want to carry with you going forward. So be super selective. As part of that, we have all gotten more comfortable with virtual presentations over the last month and a half or so. I think they're going to continue. So we need to continue to build that skill set. We need to continue to give people maybe even training on how to produce a conference call or a meeting so that the presenters are focused on presenting, and they have support from someone facilitating and managing that call as they go through the presentation. This is your time to look at some of your clients who maybe weren't great clients before the pandemic, and they're probably not any better now that the pandemic has really put us in this work from home situation and impacted the economy the way it has. So now is the time to think about changing those clients or changing out of those markets and looking at some of the new markets you want to move into. And again, this is an opportunity for more frequent but more concise communication with your client. And last but not least, Brett, my last slide. This is what I call my work from home pro tip. Your camera laptop should be at eye level. Why? When you sit in a conference room with people, you're looking at them pretty much eye level. You're not looking down and they're looking up at you. So this is my setup. Yeah, it's pretty sophisticated. It's what I could find in my garage, so I didn't have to go to the store and buy anything. But eye level, let us look at you like we're sitting across a conference room table from you. And with that, Brett, I'm going to turn it back over to you for part 2.
Very good, Patty. Thank you very much. A lot of really good advice that was in that program, that first part. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about some contractual issues. And I think by now everybody is sort of been taking a look at their contracts. If you haven't, now is a good time to start what I call a very high-level review of your agreements. Do not panic. I'm going to talk about some contractual provisions. I would be shocked if more than just a small fraction of a percentage of you had all of these provisions in your agreement. The whole point of this is not to freak anybody out, but to be able to start to piece together, look, if I'm not able to perform as I initially contracted to do on my projects, if I'm short on staff, if a project shut down, if I can't do what I initially said I was going to intend to do, I need to have a conversation with that client. How does this look going forward? How do we remedy this situation? And the very first thing that you want to do is you want to step back, take a look at your agreement, because any provisions that might help you or hurt you will help inform that conversation that you'll ultimately have maybe with your client. Prior to taking any kind of drastic reaction or any kind of drastic action, I think it's important to have a conversation with your attorney first. Certainly nothing in this program is intended as legal advice. And if you're going to terminate or suspend services, especially if things are getting contentious, especially if you're working with clients that the relationship is frayed and eroded and it's not gotten any better, talk to your counsel first. Like Patty said, it's a really important time to keep all of your channels of communication open. It's absolutely crucial that we're doing this. And if you're going to have a conversation with your client, if you're going to amend the terms, if you're going to kick out the schedule, if you're going to change your compensation or your fee or any kind of material change, always have that conversation. Have it, a verbal conversation, document it in writing, but always amend your agreement. Patty mentioned about amending your contract, amending your agreement. Most agreements have a provision, an integration clause that says the 4 quarters of this agreement, this is the entire agreement that we have. There's no contemporaneous or earlier representations. So it's important, we want to have that phone call, document it in writing, and then amend our contract. And there are probably notice provisions. There's notice provisions in a lot of agreements. It says, you know what, if you make any changes or if you see a delay coming or something's not right on the project, you've got to follow that provision in your agreement. Now, similar to what Patty was saying, if you're sending out, hard copy letters, they might go to an office where nobody is. That's fine. If you have to send something certified mail, return receipt requested, please do it, but have that conversation first, email a copy of it to the client. Make sure that everybody's on the same page and nobody can come back and say you waived a provision in your agreement, therefore this doesn't count. And whatever it is that you're doing going forward, just remember it is your people that come first. So I want to talk a little bit about force majeure clauses. I've probably said that term more in the first week of the shelter in place than I probably did in my entire lifetime. Force majeure, which is French for major force, and it is a contract provision that will excuse performance. Sometimes it delays it, oftentimes it excuses it for what is called an act of God. So when we think of acts of God, we're thinking about catastrophes like it might be a natural catastrophe, a flood, or hurricane. It could be a riot. There's a human component to it. There could be a war. These are the types of things that they are unforeseen. We didn't know this was going to happen. It is beyond our control, and it renders performance impossible or extremely difficult. So think about that for a second. It is unforeseen, beyond your control, and performance is impossible, right? Courts are going to construe these pretty narrowly. And one of the reasons they do that is it is a contract construction. The force majeure clause comes from a contract. They're going to construe those narrowly because, in large part, these are excusing performance. So that's a pretty drastic remedy. So they're going to make sure that they read that provision and apply it within the four corners of your agreement. You might think, well, I don't have a force majeure provision in my agreement. You know what? A lot of agreements don't have it. The AIA and the EJCDC, they do not have a force majeure clause, but they address a lot of the same concepts in other provisions in the agreement. So we'll talk about that a little bit today as we go through these provisions. So if you don't have this provision, that's not the end of the world. Now is a good time to think, well, you know what, maybe I'll put this in my agreement going forward. Now is a good time to do that. But keep in mind, even if you have a force majeure clause, and say, for example, it references global pandemic, something that we didn't start to see until, I think it was SARS in 2002, and then we had Ebola in 2014. That's when we start to see in commercial contracts reference to global pandemic being worked into a force majeure clause. Just because you have that, that doesn't necessarily matter, right? It's still, you still have to find that it is impossible to do your job. Just because your job is hard to do or because you're losing money doesn't mean that a court is going to enforce that. I think most design professionals really want to deliver their services. They want to get paid. They want to help the client out. There may be situations where, you know what, it just can't be done. And we might find some difficult clients that we're working with. But just because you have this, maybe you're working from home. You're under a shelter-in-place order. Your project may be deemed essential and the construction's still ongoing. Or maybe your project, there is no construction, and you just have to do the design work. And there's this big push by owners to have shovel-ready projects. So just because there is a global pandemic doesn't mean you get a pass if everybody is at home, working from home. Everybody's got a VPN. It may not be the most stable connection, but we're still able to do our jobs. So if you don't have that provision, it's okay. Now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about delays. So I'm going to be looking at some contract clauses that come from our contract guide. The Design Professional unit of Excel has a contract guide that we've put together. I'm using this because this is our guide and this is what I know, but you'll see very similar provisions in other agreements like the AIA, for example, or EJCDC. So looking at this provision from our contract guide on delays, we're talking about a provision in your contract says you're not responsible for delays beyond your control. And if you look at it, a lot of this language is very similar to what you would find in a force majeure. Natural disasters, acts of God, fires, riots. There's sort of a savings clause, this other emergencies. And what it says is not that you get to terminate the agreement, but that you're entitled to a reasonable adjustment in schedule and compensation. And because that is an outcome that is less drastic than terminating the agreement, I think courts will be a lot more inclined to enforce that provision, especially in light of a global pandemic where we're operating from home because of statewide and countywide shelter-in-place orders. All right, here's another provision you may have in your agreement, a provision that speaks to changed conditions, okay? Conditions that were not previously contemplated. So still, we're going back, we're taking that concept of force majeure, an act of God, something that is unforeseen and catastrophic, and we're rephrasing it as a changed condition, right? Circumstances or conditions that weren't contemplated, and what does it do? It allows the design professional the opportunity to renegotiate portions of the agreement. That's really important. Again, we're talking about possibly compensation, and we're talking about schedule. Now, within these provisions, and I made reference to it earlier when we talk about notice, there are notice provisions. You can't waive those, you got to follow them. And oftentimes you do have to negotiate in good faith. I know that goes without saying, but some of the forms actually spell it out, and it's a good idea. Let's talk briefly about termination and suspension of services. And a lot of times when this clause comes up, it can be perceived as very confrontational because it usually arises in the context of you not getting paid, right? One party, the client, has failed to perform because they did not pay you. And now you follow this provision. If you have it in your agreement, you've got 7 days, or there's a certain time frame. You comply with the notice requirements, and they have to pay you, or we're done. That's a provision that you have in the agreement for a reason. This should follow a conversation that you have with your client, especially on some of these some of these private projects where maybe the funding sources have dried up. What Patty was talking about earlier with the cash flow. Did you get the invoice, right? Is there anything wrong with it? Yeah, the only problem is I don't have any money. Great, well, I'm not gonna keep spinning my wheels in terms of providing services I'm not gonna get paid for. And let's have a conversation. And if you think you're not gonna get any money, then we need to figure out a way to part ways. And that's why you would have a termination provision, usually preceded by a suspension of services provision. And while it may seem kind of draconian in your agreement, you have that conversation. We have a meeting of the minds. I totally understand your situation. Maybe the bank recalled your construction loan, whatever it might be. Let's not waive any provisions in the agreement. And if we have to terminate, let's go ahead and do that. It's also an opportunity, as Patty was talking about, maybe resetting on some of these clients. If you have a client from the very outset, and this was a bad idea, and the relationship never really worked out, well, maybe now is the time to invoke that termination provision, since they're not paying you, and we can sort of part ways and spend our time and effort focusing on projects with clients that are going to pay us, and the work will be more rewarding. Even if you don't have these provisions, suspension of services or termination of services in your agreement, you can always modify your agreement. So as we go through this, and I made reference earlier about, very few firms will have all these provisions. You can still sit down with your client if you have none of these, and you can work out a deal. You can modify the agreement. It's going to be a really heavy lift for a client to say, you know what, I understand this project shut down. You're in a shelter in place. I'm going to sue you if you don't get this done. I don't think we're going to see that wave of litigation. What I think we're going to see is a lot of folks sitting down and trying to work out a reasonable solution. Another place that we see design professionals might get some relief is in a timeliness of performance. Now, the corollary to this is a time is of the essence clause. That is the kind of clause that basically takes the schedule, incorporates it into your agreement, and says, if you don't meet this schedule, you're in breach of your agreement. And the problem with that, and the reason we tell folks to try to avoid those provisions, is there might be a lot of things outside your control that are driving that schedule, like a contractor doesn't mobilize right or can't get materials. You shouldn't have to pay for that. So we do have a clause, time is of the essence. We dial that back, call it timeliness of performance, where again, we're recognizing there are many factors outside your control. In this case, it could be, well, we have a contractor, they're on site, but they can't staff the project adequately because they have to social distance. Or maybe they don't have the materials that they need because of, the shipping is shut down. There's supply chain interruption. These are things that are outside your control, but you're still going to try with reasonable diligence to complete your services on time. Now, these clauses can also allow for a schedule adjustment, and typically they have notice requirements. You cannot waive your notice requirements. If you find that there is factors outside your control that are impacting your ability to perform, you may have 7 or 10 days to notify the client in writing. But that's something that happens with a phone call right away, only to be followed up in writing. Another place where we find that design professionals can have some relief or some help in framing that conversation to modify the agreement is the standard of care provision. So we constantly try to tell our insureds, look, do not agree to these elevated standards of care, agree to a common law standard of care, right? And that common law standard of care is really based on what another design professional would do, and that language, and it comes from the industry forums, for example, AIA, currently practicing under similar circumstances at the same time and in the same locality. That is essentially what your competitor down the street would do, working on the same type of project. And that raises some interesting issues, right? It's not an unattainable standard of care, but we're talking about what would my competitor down the street do on a project that was shut down with a county or statewide shelter-in-place order? Could they perform their services? Are they performing their services remotely? And when we think about providing services in a work from home setting, it's going to be a little bit different. So I think it's fair to say, you know what, that same level of perfection or that same level of diligence might slip a little bit if you've got people who are not working together. They're in disparate teams. They don't have 2 or 3 monitors that they're used to. They don't have the large printers that they can print out sheets. And they're working on unstable VPNs. You might find that while this might frustrate your ability to deliver services, if we have a common law standard of care provision, it might give you a little bit of relief and a little bit of wiggle room. So we've talked about some contractual provisions. It is fine if you have none of those in your agreement. I would say going forward, it may not be a bad idea to throw some of those in your agreement and into your proposal language. Something to consider going forward. But if you don't have those, there still are equitable doctrines that could excuse. Now, we're talking about clients that are really going to start, compelling you to be on site, even though you can't perform your services. And these 3 doctrines, and these are things you need to talk to your attorney about, right? Because you're going to use these equitable doctrines. They're not from your contract, they're from the common law, in an effort to excuse or delay your performance. And this is usually going to happen in a claim setting. But they're pretty basic concepts. Impossibility, right? It is objectively impossible to perform my services. Now, that might be frustrated a little bit if you say, well, I'm able to work from home. But it is objectively impossible to perform construction site observation services if the project is shut down. You can't get out there. Similar doctrines, frustration of purpose. There's an unforeseeable supervening event and it destroys the purpose of the contract, and impracticability. Something that is extreme, unreasonable, and unanticipated. These are all things that can allow you to frame that conversation with your client in terms of either terminating or modifying your agreement. Now, as I wrap this up with about 2 minutes left, I want to talk about a few other considerations just from sort of a high level. For the longest time, we've been talking about consents to assignment. These are lender consents, and this is usually something that is outside of your agreement. So you sign your agreement with the owner and they say, oh, by the way, we've pledged all of our collateral as collateral to the bank. We've included our design professional agreements, and now we have this standalone agreement that they're forcing you to sign, or they want you to sign in short order, that has material changes to the agreement. This could matter if it has to do with who your new client is and how you perform your services, to what standard of care and how you get paid. Patty's talked about payment provisions. I understand if a client can't pay you, and that's up to you to work that out. But whatever you do, do not waive the payment provisions in your agreement. Send something in writing, modify your contract. You are 30 days over, 60 days over. We are allowing you to pay at a later date. We are not waiving any provisions in this agreement. For some firms to get retainers, that's great if you can get it. I don't know how realistic that is now, but if you can get some money up front, that's a great way to do it. And then be mindful of some of the concepts that if you have to shut down a project, how do we do that? How do we bill for that? What are the procedures that we go through, especially if I can't get out there? And then it's important to start thinking, Patty talked about the returning to work, right? If we have a project that's been suspended or even shut down, how do we restart that? And then as we're going through this, look, this is a really unique time. A lot of things are going, are being a challenge for us right now in terms of delivering our services. If you think someone is making a claim against you, or you hear those warning signs, if you don't finish this, I'm going to sue you, that's the time where you want to pick up the phone and call your broker. And they can report that to your carrier. Your carrier can open up a loss prevention file and oftentimes get an attorney behind the scenes. And then finally, really kind of building on what Patty talked about, now is the time. You cannot be lax. We have to effectively communicate and document all of these issues. So are there any questions? And Steve, I can turn this over to you.
There are a few questions. Oh, look at that. The first one came from Michael Strogoff, one of our good buddies at the AIA. He said he's questioning you, Brett, about the shovel-ready. How will shovel-ready projects help architects? In the Great Recession, the funding for shovel-ready projects largely benefited civil engineers and much less so architects. The only shovel-ready projects we have are those already approved for construction, which is not where most of the fee revenue stems.
No, and I can see that, and I understand that point where that might impact civils a little bit more. But what I'm seeing is a lot of firms are sort of burning through their backlog, and I think a lot of clients are looking at this and saying, you know what, we have this pandemic. At some point, we're going to open up the economy. We're going to get back to work in some way. It may not be what it was before. And right now, everybody's saying, we don't have a vaccine. This might very well come back in the fall. It might come back in the winter. I think there's going to be a push to get some of these projects done. And I think some of the design firms that I've talked to, they've expressed to me that they have clients who are driving that schedule. They do not want to grant any more time on that schedule on the design side because they want to make sure they can break ground when they can.
Okay, actually the next one's more of a request, and it should become something that actually I could provide later, but it's from Ahmed Smith. May I request a consolidated list of clauses we should add to future contracts? And so he's requesting the follow-up that we can do a little later when we issued all the rest of the questions and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. We can follow up with that.
Okay, Scott Mackey asks, should we look at negotiating stop and restart fee impacts to projects that have been delayed, put on hold, or shut down due to the pandemic?
Yeah,
I think so.
I think you should.
Okay. Next question is what is the best way to measure my staff is working productively on their projects other than meeting the deliverable dates?
Yeah, that's one of the questions that's come up in the past from a number of groups I've worked with. They're seeing high utilization. They're seeing people charging their time to projects. And the thing I want everybody to keep in mind is, yes, you're meeting your deadlines and you're meeting your quality standards, but are you meeting your project budgets? And project managers still have the need and the requirement to be looking at project budgets as well as completing the work itself. So just keep in mind, yes, you are billing time to projects. Yes, you're getting the work done, but are you getting the work done within the budget that you have for that work? And if you are being very productive. If you're not, you need to take a look at what needs to be adjusted going forward.
This is Deborah. I'm going to jump in with a question here. Relative to consultants, when they may choose to not want to go out to a job site because of a fear for their personal safety, do you have any advice for architects who are contractually obligated to have site observations done by those consultants?
You know, I think it depends on what kind of a project it is. And I mean, is it deemed essential or non-essential? And I know that sounds kind of basic. We've seen some firms working on non-essential projects where construction's ongoing. That's a potential problem. I think in terms of sending people out to essential projects that are ongoing, if they don't want to go, you know what, our health and safety comes first. And this could really make it difficult for you to provide those services. What I'm concerned about two things. One is from an employment standpoint. If I'm sending my employees out in the field and folks are afraid that they're going to contract coronavirus, am I adequately protecting them? Are they, and is everybody else on site observing social distancing, proper hygiene? Are they wearing a N95 or a face mask? You know, complying with whatever state orders that there are. And I want to make sure that I'm not getting sideways with the workers' compensation statutes. And those are sort of in flux right now. And we're kind of waiting for something to come down from the governor any day now. There's some executive order. But I want to make sure that if somebody does go out to a project, they do contract an illness, that they're going to have, that firm is going to have the benefit of the workers' compensation exclusive remedy. Now, to answer your question a little bit better, we're talking, I think the question talked about a consultant that may not be going out. Yeah. And you know, again, we can't necessarily compel people to go out there because the fear is real, right? We don't have widespread testing. There is no antibody test, and we understand that 25 to 50% of people with coronavirus may be asymptomatic. So especially if that person has a compromised immune system or they live at home with people who do, we need to be really mindful of that. And a compromised immune system it could be something as simple as, you take an immunosuppressor for psoriasis. It's that simple. So I think having that conversation with the consulting firm, And if they cannot perform the services, can you cover from that? Is there somebody else that can go out there, that somebody in your firm that can volunteer to do this? It may be something that you don't do. Is there another firm that's out there that needs the work that you can shift gears and contract that out to? That's sort of in a nutshell. Patty, did you have any thoughts on that?
No, that was good. I have nothing to add. I
got a couple that is kind of going back onto the efficiency of working from home. One, Steve Walton asked, it's going to be a two-part question. I'm going to combine two together. Has there been any metrics anyone has seen on reduced efficiency due to remote working that we can pass on to the client showing the standard of care has changed due to the reasonable extensions? And then somebody who wanted to remain anonymous is asked, is staff working from home, what are you hearing from AE firms regarding reimbursables for expenses related to working at home or allowances?
Okay. Well, I'll start. On the first one, I have not seen any metrics, and I don't know, Brett, if you have, you can jump in.
I have
not. And I think in part because I think firms are still getting their arms around that. They're still trying to figure out how they are doing in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. And they were just worried about getting to the place where people were functional. So I think that's going to come out, but I don't think it's going to be out for another couple of months at a minimum, because firms are trying to understand that. And the second question was, are you seeing any reimbursables related to an allowance for people who are working from home? I have not heard anything about that yet. I haven't heard anybody talk about that. I think the primary effort was making sure everybody had a laptop and they had connectivity and they had that part of the tools they needed to work from home. If you put together, and I hope you do, put together a work from home policy, it includes some discussion on that. For the most part, my experience with this, my personal experience, and also with other people I know that work from home as a full-time place to work, there's generally not an allowance, but the expectation is you will create an environment that is, that you have a kind of a permanent workspace where you can close a door and have a conference call without interruption. But those are things that you need to look at for policies. In terms of what people are currently doing now, I have not heard even a sound from anybody about an allowance or anything like that.
Okay, we're almost out of time. I got one more question, but I also wanted to say something first. The chat room has been pretty active, so I've asked AIA California, and they will also issue that with any questions that are answered after the fact, or along with everything else. So the last question I got today is from Remy Tan. Is COVID-19 eligible for business interruption coverage of standard business insurance practices?
You know what, so we don't deal necessarily, Patty and I don't deal in the business interruption, but my understanding of business interruption, and again, I hate to sound like I'm ducking the question, it depends on the policy and what it says. A lot of business interruption policies require some sort of physical damage. The physical damage with COVID, the question is, does contamination of my premises, does that constitute physical damage? Because it would be a loss of use. I don't know what that is. There may be law that's out there on that, but most of these policies, they exclude pandemic. They exclude disease. So these things are excluded. The one thing that is sort of taking hold right now is in different states, and I believe California, our insurance commissioner here in California has asked firms to go back and take a look at these types of coverages. I don't know where that's going to end up. But as my understanding is, most of the business interruption coverage is not covered. And the problem that I think some firms may face eventually too is there's a few other things to complicate that. Even if they did have coverage for it, if you have applied for and received, for example, a small business loan under the CARES Act or Paycheck Protection Program, you cannot also claim that money from the insurance company. They might have a subrogation. You don't get to double recover on those. So these are some things that some firms may find themselves working through, and some firms might find themselves in a situation where they're okay now. And here's the other thing: just because you're not in the office doesn't necessarily mean your business is interrupted if everybody's working from home. And where some firms may find themselves a couple months from now is we've burned through our backlog and now the economy's open, my proposal activity is down, I don't have any work. That also would probably not constitute business interruption. It would just be a bad economy. So it's a complicated issue. It depends a lot on the policy language. And I know a lot of it hinges on physical damage.
All right, thank you again for everybody for participating in today's town hall. We'll follow up with everything with the recording, and that answered the last question I got of this webinar and answers to the remaining questions, as well as the very interesting chat that went on. I want to say thank you from all of us at AI California to Brett and Patty for leading our discussion today. What a great information. We look forward to seeing you all at the next town hall meeting on May 6th.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Really appreciate
Stay
it.
safe. Alrighty.